The wind carried the smell of burnt cedar long before anyone saw the smoke. By the time the church bell echoed across the lonely frontier town of Red Hollow, a crowd had already gathered near the northern ridge. They weren't staring at a wildfire. They were staring at the ashes of a ranch that had stood untouched for nearly 30 years. One question passed from neighbor to neighbor in uneasy whispers. Who would risk burning the home of a widow who had nothing left to lose? Evelyn Carter stood silently at the edge of the blackened ruins, her hands trembling beneath the sleeves of her faded blue dress. The morning air was cool, but soot still drifted through the sky like falling snow. 6 months earlier, her husband, Daniel Carter, had ridden west with a cattle drive and never returned. His horse had wandered home alone. No body was ever found, and no one could explain what had happened beyond the distant canyons. Since then, Evelyn had done everything she could to keep the ranch alive. Every sunrise began before the roosters called. She repaired fences with blistered hands, hauled water from a creek nearly 2 miles away, and cared for the small herd that remained. Her children never complained, even though each of them carried burdens far heavier than anyone their age should have known. 15-year-old Luke had quietly become the man of the house. He worked beside his mother from dawn until nightfall, pretending not to notice how exhausted she had become. 12-year-old Sarah watched over her younger brothers, Ben and Jacob, while little Emily, barely 4 years old, still waited every evening on the porch, convinced her father would appear riding over the hills. The fire had spared almost nothing. Their barn had collapsed into charred beams. Half their stored grain had turned to ash. Even Daniel's saddle, the last thing Evelyn had refused to sell, lay blackened beneath a pile of burned timber. Neighbors offered sympathetic words, but no one stayed long enough to help. Fear had settled over Red Hollow during the past year. Too many ranchers had lost property after refusing suspicious land offers, and too many questions had gone unanswered. Standing across the road was Nathan Crowley. Unlike most cattle owners, Nathan dressed more like a successful banker than a rancher. His tailored black coat remained spotless despite the dusty street, and the polished silver watch hanging from his vest caught the morning sunlight. He greeted everyone with polite smiles, donated generously to the church, and often spoke about bringing prosperity to Red Hollow. Yet behind those smiles, people whispered another story. Every ranch bordering Nathan's expanding property had somehow changed hands after mysterious accidents, unpaid debts, or sudden disappearances. No one had ever proved a thing. No one dared accuse him openly. Nathan slowly removed his hat as he approached Evelyn. "I'm truly sorry for your loss," he said with practiced kindness. "No family deserves such misfortune." Evelyn met his eyes without speaking. He glanced toward the smoking remains of the barn before continuing. "I know this won't replace what you've lost, but I'd like to make an offer." Several townspeople stopped walking. Everyone knew what was coming. "I'll purchase your ranch for a fair price," Nathan said. "Your children deserve a fresh start somewhere safer." Luke stepped beside his mother. "We're not selling." Nathan smiled gently, though something cold flickered behind his eyes. "You should think carefully." "We already have," Evelyn answered. For a brief moment, the pleasant expression disappeared from Nathan's face. Then it returned as quickly as it had vanished. "Very well." He tipped his hat politely and walked away. But before climbing into his wagon, he quietly looked back at the burned ranch. "You'll change your mind," he said softly. "So does everyone." The words were calm, almost friendly. Yet they settled over Evelyn like a gathering storm. Late that afternoon, while Luke searched the creek for surviving livestock, Sarah noticed fresh hoofprints leading toward the burned barn. "They weren't here this morning," she whispered. Evelyn knelt beside the tracks. The horseshoes carried an unusual star-shaped mark stamped into the iron. She had seen that mark once before, on the horse ridden by a stranger who had stopped for water nearly a week earlier. Before she could think further, another sound drifted across the valley. Slow hoofbeats. Steady. Unhurried. A lone rider emerged from the western trail, dressed in a dust-covered brown duster with a weathered saddle strapped to a powerful bay horse. He wasn't armed like an outlaw, nor dressed like a lawman. He simply rode with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years crossing dangerous country. He stopped several yards from the ruins and studied the blackened ranch without speaking. Then his eyes settled on the strange horseshoe prints in the dirt. His expression changed. He climbed down from his horse, crouched beside the tracks, and brushed away the loose dust with one gloved hand. When he finally looked up at Evelyn, there was no surprise in his face. Only recognition. "I was hoping," he said quietly, "that I was too late to find these." "I was hoping," he said quietly, "that I was too late to find these." Evelyn frowned as the stranger rose from the ground, brushing the dust from his gloves. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the burned ranch, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You've seen those tracks before?" Evelyn finally asked. The rider nodded once. "More times than I'd like." Luke had returned from the creek just in time to hear the conversation. Holding the reins of a frightened mare he had managed to rescue, he stepped closer, never taking his eyes off the stranger. "And who are you?" The man removed his hat. "My name is Ethan Walker." His voice was calm but carried the weariness of someone who had spent years chasing trouble instead of running from it. "I've been tracking a group of land swindlers across 3 territories. Wherever they go, ranches burn, families disappear, and someone always ends up signing away land they never intended to sell." Evelyn's heart sank. "You think that's what happened here?" "I don't think." He looked toward the smoking ruins. "I know." The words hung heavily in the air. Sarah glanced nervously toward the road leading into town. "You mean Mr. Crowley?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a small piece of blackened wood lying near the barn. "Was this building locked before the fire?" Luke nodded. "I locked it myself." Ethan turned the charred timber over in his hand. "The fire didn't start inside." Everyone stared at him. "It started from the outside wall." He pointed toward a section of scorched ground where the flames had spread unnaturally fast. "Someone wanted the fire to move with the wind." Evelyn felt a chill despite the lingering heat. "You can tell all that just by looking?" A faint smile crossed Ethan's face. "I spent 8 years investigating ranch fires for the Territorial Marshal's office." Luke exchanged a glance with his mother. For the first time since the fire, hope quietly replaced despair. The following morning, Red Hollow appeared peaceful. Shopkeepers opened their stores. Children carried water from the town well. Cowboys laughed outside the saloon. Yet beneath the ordinary routine, rumors traveled faster than horses. People whispered that a stranger had arrived. Some claimed he was a lawman. Others believed he was a bounty hunter. Nathan Crowley heard every rumor before breakfast. Standing inside his large office overlooking the town square, he watched Ethan ride slowly down the main street. Nathan's smile never faded. "Interesting," he murmured. One of his ranch foremen stepped beside him. "Want us to keep an eye on him?" Nathan nodded. "But don't let him know." Later that afternoon, Ethan visited the county records office. The elderly clerk searched through dusty ledgers while apologizing repeatedly. "I wish I could help more," he said. "But several property files disappeared during last winter." "Disappeared?" The clerk sighed. "Someone broke in." "No suspects?" "None." Ethan closed the final ledger. That wasn't bad luck. Someone had removed exactly what they needed. As he stepped outside, he noticed a young stable boy staring at him. The boy hesitated before speaking. "Sir." Ethan knelt beside him. "What is it?" "I saw 2 men near the Carter ranch the night before the fire." Ethan remained silent. "What did they look like?" "I couldn't see their faces." The boy swallowed nervously. "But one of their horses had a silver star on its horseshoe. The same mark." Ethan reached into his pocket and handed the boy a small silver coin. "You've helped more than you know." That evening, Evelyn and her children worked together clearing burned debris from the ranch. Every broken board reminded them of what had been lost. Then Luke's shovel struck something buried beneath the ashes. "Mom!" Everyone hurried over. Half hidden under collapsed beams lay a heavy iron strongbox. The lock had melted during the fire, but the box itself remained intact. Carefully, Ethan forced the lid open. Inside rested several old papers wrapped in oilcloth. Daniel Carter's handwriting covered the first page. Evelyn's hands began trembling. "It can't be." She unfolded the letter. Her husband's final journal entries described discovering survey maps that proved valuable railroad land ran directly beneath several neighboring ranches, including theirs. Someone had secretly been buying those properties before the railroad company announced its expansion. Daniel had written one final warning. If anything happens to me, don't trust anyone offering to buy this land quickly. Someone is forcing families off their ranches. Silence filled the yard. Luke looked toward Ethan. So my father knew. Ethan slowly nodded. And it appears he died because he knew too much. Before anyone could speak again, the distant sound of galloping horses echoed across the valley. 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch. They didn't come closer. They simply watched. One of them tipped his hat before turning his horse around. Within seconds, all 3 disappeared into the gathering darkness. Ethan's expression hardened. They know we've found something. He carefully folded Daniel's journal and slipped it back into the strongbox. They won't wait much longer. A cold wind swept across the valley as the last light faded beyond the mountains. For the first time, Evelyn realized the fire had never been the end of her family's troubles. It had only been the beginning. It had only been the beginning. The words echoed in Evelyn's mind long after darkness settled over Red Hollow. The 3 riders had vanished into the hills, but their silent warning lingered over the ranch like a gathering storm. Inside the small cabin, Ethan carefully unfolded Daniel Carter's journal once more. A single page, tucked between the others, caught his attention. Unlike the rest of the entries, it wasn't written as a diary. It was a hand-drawn survey map. Several ranches were marked with neat black lines. Then Ethan noticed something unusual. A faded red X had been drawn beneath an abandoned windmill nearly 2 miles east of the Carter property. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. "I think your husband left us more than a warning." The following morning, before sunrise, Ethan, Luke, and Evelyn rode toward the old windmill while Sarah stayed behind with her younger brothers and sister. Years of neglect had left the structure leaning against the prairie wind. Rust covered its blades, and weeds surrounded the crumbling stone foundation. Luke climbed down first. "There isn't anything here." Ethan wasn't convinced. He studied Daniel's map again before walking toward a pile of loose rocks near the base of the windmill. One stone looked strangely out of place. Together, he and Luke pulled it aside. Beneath it rested a small iron chest wrapped in thick canvas. Inside were dozens of official documents, payment records, property contracts, and signed letters connecting Nathan Crowley to several suspicious land purchases across 3 counties. Even more important, they found letters exchanged between Crowley and a railroad investor discussing plans to frighten ranch families into selling before the railway expansion became public. Evelyn covered her mouth in disbelief. "This proves everything." Ethan nodded. "It proves enough." News traveled quickly through Red Hollow. By afternoon, Nathan Crowley had already learned someone had uncovered hidden records. Instead of running, he called for a public town meeting outside the courthouse. When Ethan arrived carrying the iron chest, nearly every resident had gathered. Nathan stood confidently on the courthouse steps. "My friends," he began with his usual calm smile, "you've heard wild stories spread by strangers." Several people nodded uncertainly. Nathan pointed toward Ethan. "This man knows nothing about our town." Ethan quietly stepped forward. "You're right." He placed the iron chest on a nearby table. "I wasn't here when these families lost their ranches." He removed one document after another. "But these papers were." Silence swept across the crowd. The town clerk examined the signatures first. His face immediately turned pale. "I recorded these deeds," he whispered. "They were altered after I filed them." A retired surveyor stepped forward next. He unfolded one of Daniel Carter's maps. "I made this survey 15 years ago." He looked directly at Nathan. The railroad route was never supposed to remain secret. Whispers grew louder. Neighbors who had remained silent for years slowly found the courage to speak. One elderly rancher admitted he had been pressured into selling after mysterious threats. Another family described losing livestock just days before accepting Nathan's offer. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. Nathan's confident smile finally disappeared. "You have no proof I ordered any of this," he snapped. Ethan calmly handed the judge the final letter from the chest. It carried Nathan's signature beneath instructions to make the landowners desperate before the railroad announcement. The judge read it twice. Then he looked toward Sheriff Collins. "I believe Mr. Crowley has answered his own case." The sheriff stepped forward. Nathan glanced toward his ranch hands, hoping someone would intervene. No one moved. The respect he had purchased over the years disappeared the moment the truth became undeniable. Without resistance, Sheriff Collins placed him under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, document tampering, and multiple property crimes. The crowd watched in complete silence as the wealthiest man in Red Hollow was escorted down the courthouse steps. For the first time in years, Fear no longer ruled the town. Over the following weeks, investigators reopened dozens of old property cases. Families who had believed everything was lost finally recovered their ranches. The Carter property was officially restored, and the railroad company agreed to purchase only the portion of land needed for future construction, paying fair market value instead of forcing families away. The payment was enough for Evelyn to rebuild. Neighbors who had once stood quietly on the sidelines now arrived every morning with lumber, tools, horses, and wagons. Some repaired fences. Others rebuilt the barn. Even children carried water and planted fresh trees around the new home. Red Hollow slowly became a community again. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan saddled his horse outside the rebuilt ranch. Luke noticed first. "You're leaving." Ethan smiled. "I've stayed longer than I usually do." Evelyn walked onto the porch carrying Daniel's old leather gloves. "They belong to my husband." She handed them to Ethan. "He always believed good men leave places better than they found them." Ethan accepted them quietly. "I'll take good care of them." Little Emily ran across the yard and hugged his leg. "You'll come back." He knelt beside her. "If this trail ever brings me through Red Hollow again, I'll stop here first." She smiled. "Promise." "I promise." He climbed into the saddle and tipped his hat. The family stood together as he rode toward the open prairie. No one spoke. They simply watched until he became a small silhouette beneath the endless western sky. Years later, travelers passing through Red Hollow often heard the same story. Not about the fire. Not about the railroad. Not even about Nathan Crowley's downfall. They remembered the widow who refused to surrender her home, the son who never gave up on his family, and the quiet stranger who believed that justice didn't always begin with a badge or a gun. Sometimes, it began with one person choosing to stand beside people who had no one else. As the evening sun settled behind the distant mountains, children laughed across the rebuilt Carter Ranch, horses grazed peacefully in green pastures, and fresh wind turned the blades of a brand new windmill. The scars of the past had not disappeared. They had simply become reminders that courage, honesty, and hope could outlast fear. And in the untamed heart of the American frontier, that was the kind of legacy worth leaving behind.